did the struggle for a border actually go on? Looking back, you might think that it was over by 1846. That was the year that Britain and the United States settled their dispute over the Oregon Territory. And now the boundary line was fixed across the middle of the continent almost exactly as we know it today. But the struggle was hardly over. In the century and a half that had gone before, Canadians, French or English, had been involved in no fewer than 6 full-scale wars with their neighbors to the south. Most of these had been inspired by fear of Canada as a potential attacker. But now, this fear had almost vanished. However, many Americans still had a strong desire to expand their territory, and the wide open spaces of British North America might become a tempting target. Efforts to seize Canadian territory in the American Revolution and in the War of 1812 had failed. After 1812, American imperialism had turned south to easier targets in the Spanish-speaking world, Florida, Texas, California. But mightn't it soon be Canada's turn again? Also, certain Americans presented an ideological threat for Canada with their Republican anti-monarchy propaganda. To survive, Canada had to show determination. But from the 1830s on, there were plenty of signs that this determination might be lacking.
In London, there was growing concern over unrest in colonial Canada, for there had been rebellion there in 1837. And now, as the young Queen Victoria listened to her advisors, she learned that the situation was still grave. Some English leaders called for tighter imperial control over Canada, while others suggested more political and economic freedom for the colony. One thing was certain: a change was needed, especially with Canadian rebel leaders across the border in the United States still fanning the flames of revolution. Here, it was easy to rouse support among Republicans who would be only too glad to invade Canada again. With these threats to British authority in the background, Queen Victoria's government decided it would send John Lambton, Lord Durham, to Canada. He would find the causes of unrest and would suggest remedies, although some cynics suggested that this was just a joyride for radical Jack Durham. In Quebec, Lord Durham was surrounded by reminders of British imperial rule, such as the citadel that towered above the city like a military proclamation. The British Army was master here and was determined to stay. But there were also venerable streets and lofty churches to remind Durham of the French and Catholic character of the historic St. Lawrence Valley. Nearby at Wolfe's Cove, Durham could see the spot where his problems had begun, for events here some 80 years before had led to Britain's conquest of New France. Ambitious Protestant traders had followed the conquest, but over the years they had made little impact on the French-Canadian way of life, and they had helped to create among the habitants a deep dislike for Anglo-Saxon officialdom. The French Canadians began to compare their poverty and toil with English Canadian wealth and well-being. And aspiring leaders compared their political impotence with the privilege and power of the English. There was deep resentment, too, in paying taxes that would benefit the English merchants by creating public works that seemed useless to the French. Bolder spirits among the Quebecers had been rallied by the oratory of Louis-Joseph Papineau, who denounced colonial oppression and ultimately called for a republic. This had brought rebellion, but it had been short-lived, ruthlessly suppressed by British gunfire. The deportations and executions that followed greatly deepened the hostility between the two peoples of Canada.
Durham understood why Canadian radicals had rebelled. He minced no words in calling for responsible government for the colony, an executive responsible to elected representatives. The Canadians should be masters in their own house. If coercive imperial bonds were loosened, deeper emotional ties would grow to link Canada with Britain. This alone was the answer to republicanism. But on the so-called racial issue, Durham outraged the French Canadians. He said they were a people with no history and no literature. They must give up their vain hopes for nationality and submit to vigorous rule by the superior English. It was an attitude that would poison English-French relations for a long time to come.
Sailing from Quebec, Durham returned to England to give the Prime Minister the famous report embodying his conclusions. London rejected Durham's plea for responsible government, but it did adopt his recommendation that Upper and Lower Canada become one political entity. This union was effected in 1840, making the French feel like a helpless minority rather than a frustrated majority. But in Montreal, the English were pleased, for the boundary had been an obstacle to commerce. But soon, in London, agricultural interests were fighting another measure that would help Montreal. In 1843, however, the Canada Corn Act was passed, and now American wheat shipped through Canada would be given British tariff preference. Now the route to Europe through Canada's St. Lawrence River system would surely demonstrate its superiority over the American Hudson-Erie route. Rapids on the St. Lawrence system had led to the building of canals, and now these were improved and augmented in a vigorous new program of public works. The Lachine Canal near Montreal was deepened to 9 feet, as compared with the Erie Canal's 4 feet. And the Welland Canal was also improved. American wheat, ground into flour, shared in the tariff preferences, and shiny new mills arose to handle the heavy traffic anticipated by Canadian investors. More transportation would be needed, and the shipbuilding industry turned out a host of proud new vessels. Everywhere, hopes were high that Canada's ports would flourish as never before. But traffic on the St. Lawrence turned out to be far less than had been expected. Although it was cheaper and easier to get from the west to Montreal than to New York, Montreal's port charges were higher, and the navigational hazards of the river route beyond Montreal, with its storms and its twisting channel, meant high rates for pilotage and insurance on the long voyage to the sea. Thus, the cost factor militated against Montreal's ambitions. And so, despite the best efforts of Montreal, Western trade continued to drain away to the other route provided by the Erie Canal and the Hudson River. This trade came from fast-growing lake ports like Chicago, where the first wheat shipment in 1838 had heralded an ever-increasing flow of traffic toward the Atlantic coast. After crossing the lakes to Buffalo, cargoes had to be reloaded into flat canal barges drawn by horses. But even this necessity for transshipment did not detract from the popularity of the Erie Canal. From Buffalo, goods proceeded at 1.5 miles per hour and 1.5 cents per mile. It was the best bargain, cheap and safe. After the canal came the smooth Hudson River, with the dynamic port of New York at its mouth. The harbor here was ice-free the year round, another advantage over Montreal. Meanwhile, to the north, a discouraged Montreal newspaper noted that winter had arrived and that an embargo which no human hand can remove is laid on all our ports. While winter might bring all kinds of zestful outdoor sport, it meant long months of stagnation for the commerce of Canada's inland waterways. And now, in addition to the ice, there was another threat. The first railways made their appearance in the United States in the 1830s. And before long, they were puffing away in every direction, carrying goods and passengers. For the St. Lawrence River route, it meant still more competition. Soon there was a network of feeder lines leading to the sea. And even more serious, a new law now allowed Canadian exports and imports to pass through the United States duty-free on their way to and from American ports. So Canadian goods, too, flowed to New York. But railroads also offered the possibility of adding an ice-free Atlantic port to the St. Lawrence system. And soon, Montrealers were drawing up plans for lines to Portland and Boston. The first small step in this direction came in 1836 with Canada's first railway, 14 miles long, near Montreal. Meanwhile, across the sea in England, John Bull faced an upheaval that would have repercussions in Canada. In the Corn Exchange, the landowning Tories discussed ways to keep cheap imported food out of the country, so their own produce would fetch the highest possible prices. British agriculture traditionally had great political influence, but the winds of change were blowing, and the very landscape was being altered. For England's green and pleasant land was now increasingly scarred by mines and mills as the tempo built up in the Industrial Revolution. The factories were creating a powerful new class, the managerial middle class, whose interests clashed with those of the agricultural landlords. The stock exchanges symbolized the growing power of this new class, which sought political solutions for its problems, problems that involved the poverty of the workers in the slums. Industrialization had brought unprecedented misery, with streams of laborers leaving the farms for the overcrowded cities. Here there were long hours of back-breaking work for pathetic wages. Employers wanted food made cheaper, so the workers could be kept alive on the lowest possible wage. One way to bring food prices down would be through free trade, with the abolition of the whole system of imperial tariff preferences on which Canada had built her economic hopes. The factory owners of the new middle class in England were growing in wealth and political power. It was these men who formed the Anti-Corn Law League to fight the high cost of food. They were determined to end the nation's dependence on expensive British grain and protected imperial imports. And Richard Cobden, their chief philosopher, attacked a system which he said was less concerned with the welfare of humans than the welfare of pigs. And so the long-protected landowning Tories joined battle with the new industrialists. The political race of the century was on, with banners unfurled. The Tories argued that Britain's wealth was her agriculture, and this must be protected against foreign competition. But the free traders insisted that if manufacturing costs could be kept down through low wages and cheap bread, then exports would be cheap and everyone would prosper. The Tories protested that all the factory owners really cared about was saving on wages. But Cobden was a master propagandist, and to more and more people, his loaf looked like the very best buy. Even Sir Robert Peel, the Tory Prime Minister, came to agree with Cobden. Peel was disturbed by stories of famine in Ireland and depression at home. So he finally decided to support the idea of cheap bread, even though this would split the Tory party. Under Peel's leadership, the Corn Laws were repealed in 1846. Now there was free trade, and Canada was left in the lurch, without the imperial preferences that had nourished her commercial ambitions. Storms on the St. Lawrence symbolized the rough weather that lay ahead for Canada's economy. Now, American wheat could go straight to Britain without passing through Canada, and many a mill closed its doors for lack of business. In the wintry Montreal of 1848, it seemed that the new commercial empire of the St. Lawrence was mortally wounded. And it had been so patiently built up to replace the long-gone fur-trading empire. A chilling blanket of gloom descended on the icy streets of the city's business community.
Montreal's businessmen reacted with bitterness. They were Englishmen and Tories, and now England had pulled the rug out from under them. On top of this, there was the Rebellion Losses Bill to anger them. This legislation appropriated £100,000 to compensate those who had suffered property loss in the uprising of 1837. French-Canadian rebels would share in the compensation, and the angered English loyalists demanded that the Governor-General veto the bill. French domination, they cried. But Lord Elgin refused to interfere, and this meant, in effect, that responsible government had come to Canada. For the English merchants, it was the end of special privilege, and they reacted with violence.
And on an April night in 1849, a Tory mob set fire to Canada's Parliament buildings in Montreal. The firemen were mocked in their hopeless struggle by a chant of Tory hatred. And strangely enough, the men who had been driven to this outburst of violence, to this destruction of a British institution, were the very men who most fondly cherished memories of loyalty to Britannia. Memories of loyalty under Wolfe at Quebec, of loyalty in wars against the Indians, memories of loyalty and suffering during the American Revolution, when their fathers had stood by Britain. And of course, 1812. But what devils now infested the land of Britannia? What scoundrels now ruled England, turning her against her loyal sons in Canada? New men were at the helm in England. And in Canada, the smoking ruins of Parliament attested the fury of loyalty and love that felt rejected. And now, that rejected love suddenly took a surprising direction. A manifesto calling for union with the United States. It was drawn up 6 months after the burning of Parliament, and it got nearly 1,500 important signatures. British sovereignty voluntarily surrendered to the Yankees. This was the proposal of the Annexation Manifesto, and it was being made by leaders of the commercial community in Montreal. It would simplify the map of North America in such a way that the St. Lawrence system would work at last. With American capital, credit, and price structures, prosperity would finally come, in the form of ships to crowd the river. The Canadian group anxious to embrace Uncle Sam was mainly English, but there were Irishmen in it too. They had their own motives, stemming from the tragic history of misery in their home country, where the failure of the potato crop had brought famine in the 1840s. For many Irishmen, emigration to North America was the only escape from slow death in their overpopulated country. Half-starved and fever-ridden, many families headed for Lower Canada, and with them they brought a strong resentment against British oppression. British authority had brought them starvation, and now some were ready to support any move against England. In the movement to join the United States, the Montreal English and Irish elements were joined by a small but lively French-Canadian faction. Ideas from Paris had influenced these Quebecers, ideas which in France and all over Europe had brought violent disturbances in 1848 to challenge both civil and religious authority. These radical European ideas held great appeal for Louis-Joseph Papineau. British rule was once again the target for this Quebec rebel of 1837, now back from exile and calling for liberty, democracy, and union with the United States. Meanwhile, the annexationists were being closely watched in Britain, where the Prime Minister, Lord Russell, was surrounded by a swarm of problems arising out of troubles at home and a restless empire. Lord Russell's policy for Canada had shown indecision on earlier occasions, and this had caused him trouble. But now his reaction to the Annexation Manifesto was resolute, reflecting the contempt reserved by John Bull for scurvy Republican knaves. Republicanism was foreign nonsense. The majestic lion of constitutional monarchy might well scold the democratic donkey for his schoolboy errors. Thus, in the reply sent by Her Majesty's government to the annexationists in Canada, they were bluntly advised that their movement was scarcely short of treasonable. Back in Canada, the word treason was upsetting to many respectable people who had naively hoped that Britain might approve union with the United States. It was a confusing time of conflicting loyalties and desires, and some people played it safe by sporting both flags on the same pole. But the Union Jack in Tory Toronto was still the flag that exerted the strongest emotional pull. Great value was placed on the English heritage here, and although businessmen were irritated by Britain, they were starting to look at the supposed commercial advantages of union with an increasingly skeptical eye. As for the Irish, it seemed that George Washington's republic was attractive to them for no reason other than its anti-British flavor. And for most French Canadians, the American juggernaut posed a special threat. On the map as it now stood, the French balanced the English of Canada. But if Canada became American, the French would become an isolated minority overwhelmingly outnumbered. Thus, any onrush of Americanism was seen as a real danger to French cultural survival. Though Canada appeared vulnerable to the Eagle's attack, the Crown had its champions, ready to come to the rescue to save her from being devoured. They were alert to the possibility that the little group of annexationists might tempt some Americans to respond. For in Washington, there were still men who dreamed of more territory and who might like to dress themselves in the regalia of a crusade against the Crown. Those who feared American aggression recalled President Monroe, a quarter of a century earlier, whose nationalism seemed to provide a formula for imperialism. Had he not hinted that the United States would support rebellions against European rulers in the Western Hemisphere? Might not this apply to Canada? Henry Clay was another ghost of the war hawk past, and so was Thomas Hart Benton. And now there was Zachary Taylor to worry about. He was a general who had won many victories over the Mexicans, a man who showed great enthusiasm in using troops to expand the size of the Republic. Victory in Mexico inflamed war fever in the United States, and a grateful nation elected General Zachary Taylor to the presidency. But many feared that he would be a tool of the expansionists, who believed it was America's manifest destiny to conquer all North America. Would manifest destiny look northward? The great expanses of British North America were tempting, but there were richer areas to compete for the attention of the expansionists. Seizures of Spanish and Mexican territory had already given the United States Florida and Texas. Now it was New Mexico and California, where gold had been discovered. Now all America cried, "California, here I come." Many a potential buccaneer, who might gladly have troubled the Canadian border, went to California instead, driven by a greed so great that in San Francisco Bay, ships lay unmanned, their crews having deserted to go to the mines. Once again, it seemed that America's adventures in the South and West kept potential pressure away from Canada. But there were still some hungry eyes in Washington that persisted in looking northward. The militant spirits included General Winfield Scott, who was shown as a wild man in a cartoon of the time. Moderates were restraining him as he zealously preached annexation of Canada, while a chorus of Canadian voices mocked him by reminding him of the War of 1812. As a youth, General Scott had served in that war, and surely ought to remember how the Americans had failed in that dream of conquest. Friends of the Canadian annexationists evoked little response. And President Taylor himself was restrained throughout. And the American Navy stopped a few would-be warriors, all set to sail on a private mission of conquest. In this comic opera episode, Cuba was the preferred target, but Canada was not forgotten. And so there was no increased pressure on Canada. There were bigger opportunities elsewhere to beckon American energies.
It became obvious to the English-speaking annexationists in Montreal that they had no real support. They had earned a stern reprimand from Britain, and the United States was not exactly reaching out to them. As for the French Canadians, they were coming to realize that the survival of their culture was more likely in a small Canada than in a huge United States. Moreover, they were finding that politics in Canada tended to divide along class lines rather than racial lines, and it had become possible to cooperate with the English reformers of Upper Canada. And so the annexationist mood subsided. But there was obviously something wrong with the Canadian economic system. Unless it was corrected, there might be another movement to join the United States, and the Americans might be more responsive.
The somber expanse of Canada. Without British economic protection, could this ever become a commercial state? perhaps only Indians could live here after all. Yet all around, there was a vast potential source of wealth, the forests. For many years, Canadian timber had had a lucrative market in England, where it enjoyed strong tariff preferences. But now, in the movement toward free trade, these preferences had been withdrawn. For pessimists in Montreal, there was doubt whether the timber trade, once so brisk, could now survive at all. In London, at the Exposition of 1851, Canadian timber merchants showed their wares to the world in the great Crystal Palace. The interest aroused proved that with or without tariff protection, a good product could still find a market. And buyers found that Canadian squared pine was indeed a good and competitive product. But meanwhile, in Canada, Parliament continued to battle economic problems, and Lord Elgin, the Governor-General, was much absorbed by them. Elgin refused to be pessimistic and kept pointing to positive factors, like the improvements recently completed on the St. Lawrence, where the deepening of the channel below Montreal meant that bigger ships could now use the river. Elgin was also encouraged by recent progress in the building of railways. Typical of the enterprises underway was the Great Western, which started from Niagara, passed through Hamilton, and reached the town of London by 1853. Here was access to a rapidly growing grain production area. In the United States, railways already linked the Great Lakes and the sea. But Montreal would also have a short route to ice-free Atlantic ports, with railways to Boston via the American network and to Portland. So Lord Elgin could be moderately optimistic. The improved St. Lawrence waterway was beginning to see at least a portion of the two-way Anglo-American traffic that had so long been hoped for. Underlying this was a boom economy in England, whose growing demand greatly expanded Canadian wheat and timber production. And for the recently rebellious Montreal merchants, the return of profits meant a return of loyalty to the Crown. As a diplomat, Lord Elgin was fully aware of the American role in these developments. And in 1851, he journeyed south to Boston to lend his presence to the celebrations marking the arrival of the first train from Montreal. For Boston, the new railway would provide a bridge through Canada to the Great West, the Ohio-Mississippi area, whose growing cities mirrored the relentless expansion of America. What a difference there was between the rustic Chicago of 1820 and the busy commercial Chicago of 1850. Also phenomenal was the growth of Detroit. As for Pittsburgh, it was already becoming an industrial giant. America's growth needed building materials, and new railways, like the ones linking Boston and Ogdensburg and Bytown and Prescott, were built to bring lumber down from Canada. The New York Central already linked New York and Niagara, and now the Great Western was built through Canada to join it with the Michigan Central, which went to Chicago. And at Niagara, where a deep gorge separated the two countries, new economic ties were symbolized by a great new bridge.
But despite the return of better times, Elgin remained cautious. If the boom were to pass in Canada while the United States maintained its prosperity, there might well be a new cry for annexation. Up till now, Canada had given little thought to reciprocal trade with the United States. There had been some exchange of goods between the two countries, but Canadian businessmen had mainly acted as middlemen between the United States and Britain. It now occurred to Elgin that the benefits of real reciprocal trade might stave off any future annexationist moves. Could this trade be encouraged? For the answer, Elgin looked south, and he found problems.
The fast growth of New York symbolized a powerful new force in America, the expansion of industry in the northern states. Here and elsewhere along the Atlantic seaboard, new industries were springing up at an unprecedented rate, and like infant industries everywhere, they feared competition and sought high tariffs. Thus, many northern industrialists fought every move toward reciprocity, threatening to bury Lord Elgin's hopes. But when Lord Elgin looked further south, he found a very different America. This was a vast world of plantations and had no significant industry. It was, therefore, strongly opposed to tariffs that would raise the price of imported goods. Cotton had brought great wealth to the South and gave it power in its quarrel with the North over tariffs. But slavery was an even more bitter issue between North and South, and it threatened to tear the country asunder. There were really two societies in the United States, one with slavery and one without. The question now concerned the huge new areas of the West. Would they be slave or free? In the late 1840s, the issue aroused violent passions, with the idea of slavery repugnant to most Northerners. And yet to Southerners, it was the white man's right to take his slaves with him when he went west to settle new lands. Never had there been such an angry dispute. Tempers became so heated that on one occasion, a Southern senator actually pulled a pistol on a Northern senator. With compromise urgently needed, Henry Clay proposed a solution in a superb speech to the Senate. It succeeded, and thus ended a deadlock that had kept American politicians too busy to consider helping Canadian annexationists. Clay's compromise admitted California to the Union as a free state, while slavery would be permitted in New Mexico and Utah. Northern politicians were pleased, but Southern leaders like John Calhoun were left burning with resentment and defiance. Meanwhile, far from the heat of Southern anger, an issue that seemed to be unrelated drew the attention of Lord Elgin. In these icy waters, which stretched from Labrador to Maine, there were fabulous schools of fish that for centuries had attracted fishermen from every quarter. But now these quiet harbors echoed to the sounds of an international dispute as to just who had the right to fish here. New England fishermen felt it their natural right to be here, off Britain's maritime colonies. But Newfoundlanders, Nova Scotians, and New Brunswickers insisted it was illegal. After the American Revolution, the Americans managed through negotiation to retain their rights off this coast. But after the War of 1812, the peace treaty excluded American fishermen from most of Britain's territorial waters. The question now was, just what constituted territorial waters? One way to define the limits was to draw a line 3 miles out to sea, following the curves of the shoreline. Foreign ships could fish in the bays, but only outside the 3-mile limit. Another theory, held by the Nova Scotians, said that the line ran from headland to headland, and thus American fishermen must stay out of the bays altogether. But fishing was better inside the bays, so naturally that was where the Americans wanted to be. and some New Englanders went right into shore, cheerfully ignoring both interpretations of the treaty. American fishermen insisted this was their right, dating back to pre-revolutionary days. But to the British, they were common poachers with a disregard for the law that was typically Yankee. What they needed was a lesson from the Navy. In May 1852, 19 British cruisers arrived to drive out American fishermen. It became a time of exciting chases and arrests. Under the eyes of the Royal Navy, fishing off the Maritimes became a very hazardous occupation for Americans, and they now saw John Bull as an ugly bully, cutting off the very means of livelihood from the honest New England fisherman and his starving family. So disturbed were the New England fishermen that they managed to pressure Washington into sending a small naval squadron to the disputed fishing grounds. It seemed that John Bull and Brother Jonathan were squaring off again for what might well be a dangerous head-on collision. The British Lion could afford to be cocksure. The Royal Navy was still supreme at sea, and its guns were not to be trifled with. But although Brother Jonathan wept, the British were careful not to be too rough, for they didn't really want to fight. Instead, they wanted to use these bones of contention for diplomatic purposes, to win concessions from the Americans in other areas.
The concessions the British wanted had to do with trade. They wanted food products and raw materials from their North American colonies to be allowed into the United States duty-free. In return, the Americans would get the fishing privileges they wanted, as well as free navigation on the St. Lawrence and free entry into Canada for their raw materials. At first, the maritime colonies, particularly Nova Scotia, objected, for it was their fisheries that were at stake. But they came round after considering the advantages of selling lumber, coal, and fish in the United States. Now, this idea of reciprocal trade had long been Lord Elgin's favorite formula, and now he had the solid backing of the government in London.
The British government had advanced reciprocity proposals that seemed agreeable to the American administration, but there was doubt whether Congress would consent. So the persuasive Lord Elgin was sent to Washington. In Washington's high society, Elgin was suave and confident. But could diplomacy succeed in a country where North and South seldom agreed on anything? The South was deeply suspicious about Northern motives in supporting reciprocity. The North professed to see a bright economic future in free trade, but the South wondered whether there wasn't more to it than that. Could the North be dreaming of a day when trade with Canada might blossom into annexation? The South was outraged at the idea. Union with Canada would make the anti-slavery North far bigger than the South. This fear had to be allayed. And Lord Elgin set about presenting a more accurate picture, using fine champagne to bolster good arguments about the North American economy. Entertaining the Southern senators lavishly, Elgin pointed out that a starving Canada would always want to join the rich United States, but a Canada fattened by reciprocity would want to remain independent. Elgin's skillful persuasion worked, and enough of the skeptics were converted to give reciprocity a solid majority. Before the Reciprocity Treaty, the main pattern of trade in North America had been from east to west. Canada's share had always been insufficient. But now there was the possibility of greatly increased north-south trade, which became the goal of both countries. In Canada, the lumber industry got a great boost from the Reciprocity Treaty. The production of square timber for the British market had long been profitable. And now there was a new demand from the mushrooming American cities for cheap boards and planks. Before long, British North America was dotted with busy sawmills. Besides lumber, the products of Canadian mines were starting to make their way south. Soon there was a healthy list of exports flowing across the boundary that for so many years had frustrated the ambitions of Canadian commerce. Thus, the 1850s saw a sharp acceleration in north-south trade. And there was a more efficient continental use of resources, like Pennsylvania coal going to Canada West and Nova Scotia coal finding markets in New England. Meanwhile, in England, railways had spread extensively, and there were experienced builders and financiers ready to invest in new Canadian railways. Their skill and capital made possible the ambitious plan that would fill in the major gap on the Canadian railway map. A Grand Trunk line would traverse the country and would promote east-west trade to a point where it would balance the north-south axis. In the process, the St. Lawrence system would be strongly reinforced. New bridges, new tracks, new stations. An exciting period of expansion as a mainline system 1,000 miles long became a fact in the 1850s. And what pride in those locomotives. And greatest achievement of all, there was the Victoria Bridge at Montreal. Here and in shipbuilding was evidence of the growing pace of Canadian development. Craftsmanship of all kinds and farm produce. There was much to display at exhibitions in the growing country during the railway age. Prosperity brought bright new facades to places like Toronto, with its fine hotels, its ambitious commercial buildings, and the beginnings of its university. Structures became ornate and imposing in Toronto and Hamilton, as members of the upper crust tried their best to emulate the elegance of London. And there was a British quality, too, in the down-to-earth individualism of the farmers of Upper Canada, who were hardy enough to master the extremes of climate and even make sport of it. With their veneration of fair play, the English Canadians embodied some of the best qualities of John Bull. And yet they sometimes had grandiose notions of lordliness, and they considered themselves vastly superior to the uncouth Yankee who dominated the continent. In Canadian eyes, the Americans were loud, lawless, violent, and ill-bred. Scorn for the Yankee and scorn for the French Canadian. The Quebecer had a cool dislike for the Upper Canadian, and the Upper Canadian misread this as the stubborn backwardness of a people inexplicably less progressive than himself. The smaller towns of Upper Canada, the Cobourgs, the Port Hopes, the Kingstons, reflected a life that was cozy and comfortable. European travelers, contrasting it with the United States, found it less vital and dynamic, but it was a considerable achievement, and it was all the more to be treasured because of the fact that just outside the door, there often lay a brooding and untouched wilderness. Immigrant ships from British ports did a steady business throughout these years, crossing to ports on the St. Lawrence. Their decks were crowded with the adventurous and the underprivileged, eager to escape overcrowding and poverty and make a fresh start in a more promising world. The hazards of the bush were overcome, and the country saw the steady growth of a modest chain of settlements that pushed back the wilderness, north and west to Lake Huron, and southward to the American border in Quebec. By the end of the 1850s, almost all of the good arable land south of the Canadian Shield had been filled up. But in Britain, the emigrants continued to leave for Canada. In Canada, unlike the United States, the rocky Canadian Shield blocked any easy movement to the west. And there were also desolate lands that cut Canada off from the maritime colonies. As a country, Canada was indeed cribbed, cabined, and confined. For some years now, the shortage of new farmland had led many French Canadians down the winding roads that crossed the border into New England. Here they found jobs in factory towns like Lawrence and Lowell, Manchester and Providence. Life was agreeable here, and so many French Canadians became Franco-Americans. At the same time, surplus population from English Canada was moving south and west across the border into the Ohio-Mississippi farmlands, adding a Canadian element to the flow of American pioneers. These departures from Canada were frustrating to Canadian patriots, who felt they militated against the growth and development of the country. For it was the lands from Michigan to Minnesota that were being settled, not the still empty British Northwest. Yet this movement across the continent, south and west, spared Canada the pressure that might have been created if the Americans had chosen instead to expand northward. Meanwhile, for Canada's railway promoters, there was discouragement over competition from new American lines. The limits imposed by Canadian geography again became apparent, as traffic was drained away by feeder lines leading south. Besides American competition, there were other worries for the railway builders. Hasty construction for quick profits could and did lead to bad wrecks, and overbuilding could lead to business crackups. Thus, in Canada, railways and financial catastrophe became synonymous, and many a promoter was haunted by nightmares involving his own puffing, snorting, debt-ridden creation. Among the schemes that were going sour was one that had been particularly cherished by Canadian promoters. Canada was already linked by rail to Boston and Portland. But why rely on these American outlets? Why not a railway from Quebec to Halifax, thus linking Canada with the lively and industrious maritime colonies? The people of the Maritimes were vigorous, proud, and independent. New Brunswickers were convinced that their forests were the best and that their lumbermen had no equal. For Nova Scotians, their fisheries led all others. And as for shipbuilding, they had no rivals anywhere in the world. But when it came to trade with the West Indies, for instance, American competition was getting the lion's share, with more capital to work with and cheaper products to sell. Thus, a slow decline set in the Maritimes, especially as iron steamships replaced wooden sailing vessels. Were the Maritimes doomed to stagnation? There was a need for new economic orientation, perhaps to Canada. But Canada remained remote. and the scheme for a railway to Quebec was for years frustrated because of financial and political obstacles. The costs would be enormous. But now a railway to Portland was being suggested to link the Maritimes with the American system. Exports going south had already increased thanks to reciprocity. But the question was, might all this not make it inevitable that the Maritimes would someday join the United States?
Lord Elgin went back to England, convinced that his reciprocity treaty would give Canadians the prosperity they wanted, to the extent that they would never again think of joining the United States. Trade flowing east and west would be supplemented by trade flowing north and south with the United States. It would be a continental approach, a new equation for Canadian survival. But the pull to the south could become overwhelming, and the way Americans were already going at Canadian resources made some people think that Canada might end up by being developed mainly for the benefit of the United States. Indeed, there were some who already thought that the only solution would be for Britain's various North American colonies to unite in a single nation to counterbalance the giant to the south.